Clara Bennett, a quiet baker in Ashland, Oregon, has secretly fed a mysterious veteran at a bus stop for 6 years, leaving warm pastries and notes of kindness. Unnoticed by most, her compassion stems from her father's silent battle with PTSD. Whispers about her actions stir tension at the bakery, but Clara persists undeterred. On her wedding day, the man from the bench appears, sparking curiosity and judgment among guests. As Clara embraces him, the church doors swing open, revealing a stunning truth that will unravel Victor's hidden past and forever change how the town sees kindness. We hope Clara and Victor's story inspires you. Please like, subscribe, and share to support our channel. Join our community to celebrate kindness and compassion. Share your own stories in the comments. We'd love to hear how you make a difference. Together, let's honor the unseen heroes among us. The murmur rippled through the church like a sudden breeze, sharp and disbelieving. "You didn't actually invite him, did you?" a guest whispered, her voice barely above a breath, her gaze fixed on the man who had just crossed the threshold. He stood there, a solitary figure, framed by the heavy wooden doors, his threadbare suit hanging loosely on his gaunt frame, the cuffs frayed and the fabric faded from years of wear. His shoes, scuffed and worn thin at the soles, squeaked faintly against the polished floor. His face, etched with deep lines that told of a life weathered by hardship, carried a quiet dignity, though his eyes darted nervously, as if unsure of his welcome. The bride, radiant in her flowing gown, caught sight of him from the altar. Her heart leaped, a rush of warmth flooding her chest. Without a moment's hesitation, she gathered the delicate layers of her dress in her hands, the silk rustling as she moved, and hurried down the aisle. The crowd, a sea of stunned faces, parted in her wake, their whispers trailing her like a shadow. She reached the old man, her arms opening wide, and enveloped him in an embrace that felt like home. Confusion pulsed through the pews, a wave of hushed questions and furrowed brows, until the church fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Then the doors swung open again, the sound sharp and commanding. 12 Marines, resplendent in their dress blues, marched in with a precision that seemed to still the air itself. Their boots struck the floor in perfect rhythm, the sound echoing like a heartbeat through the sacred space. Their medals gleamed under the soft light, filtering through the stained glass windows, their faces solemn yet resolute. They came to a halt beside the bride, their movements fluid and synchronized. And as one, they raised their hands in a crisp salute, not to a general, not to a dignitary, but to the woman standing before them, her arms still wrapped around the weathered man. This was Clara Bennett, the quiet soul who for 6 uncelebrated years had fed a forgotten soldier, offering him not just sustenance but a flicker of hope in a world that had long since turned its back on him. Clara had never been one to chase the spotlight. She moved through life with the understated grace of morning rain, steady and soothing, yet easily overlooked by those who did not pause to notice. Her presence was a quiet comfort, like the soft patter of droplets on a tin roof, reliable in its rhythm, but rarely remarked upon. She had grown up in a modest home on the edge of Ashland, Oregon, a small town cradled by the gentle hills of the Rogue Valley. The house, with its creaking wooden floors and shelves lined with well-worn books, always carried the faint scent of chamomile tea brewing on the stove. Her father, Gerald Bennett, was a Gulf War veteran whose eyes held a distant, haunted horizon, as though he could still see the deserts he'd left behind. Her mother, Linda, was a hospice nurse with a rare gift for bringing light to those in their final days, her gentle hands and warm smile coaxing moments of peace from even the most restless souls. Clara idolized them both, her heart swelling with pride at her father's quiet strength and her mother's boundless compassion. But life, as Clara learned far too young, had a way of folding in on itself, crumpling even the sturdiest foundations. When Clara was 11, the father who had once hoisted her onto his shoulders to teach her how to ride a bike began to fade. Gerald, the man who had shown her how to polish shoes until they shone like mirrors, grew quieter, his laughter replaced by long silences. His nights were restless, haunted by memories he couldn't share, and his mornings were hollow, as though the man he'd been had slipped away in the dark. PTSD, a term Clara only half understood at the time, wrapped its invisible chains around him, pulling him further from the family who loved him. One crisp spring morning, he left for his usual walk along the river, his steps slow but deliberate. He didn't return. They found him near the water's edge, his old boots neatly aligned, his dog tags glinting atop a folded note. Linda read it alone, her face a mask of quiet grief, and Clara never asked what it said. Some truths, she sensed, were too heavy to be spoken aloud. In the months that followed, a silent understanding grew between mother and daughter, a shared recognition that pain often hides in the spaces where words fail, that some people carry burdens the world never sees. From that moment, Clara began to notice the invisible. She saw the man who swept the diner's floors long after the last customer had gone, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She noticed the woman at the laundromat, her hands trembling as she folded clothes, her fingers calloused from years of labor. She watched the veterans at the bus stop, their eyes flinching at the sharp crack of an engine backfiring, their faces betraying stories they'd never tell. By 17, Clara found solace in baking, her hands kneading dough as a way to anchor herself in a world that felt unsteady. It was more than a hobby, it was a quiet rebellion against the chaos of loss, a way to create something tangible, something that could bring by where it was scarce. At 19, it became her purpose. She enrolled in a culinary program at the local community college, her evenings filled with the scent of rising dough and the soft hum of her mother's encouragement. She took a part-time job at Morning Rise, a cozy bakery in the heart of Ashland, its sunlit windows and flaky croissants a beacon for early risers. Within a few years, Clara's talent had transformed her into the bakery's head baker. She arrived each morning long before dawn, her apron dusted with flour before the first bird stirred. To the town, she was a quiet marvel, the girl whose golden touch turned simple ingredients into moments of delight. Her pastries vanished from the shelves before noon. Her coffee blends drew regulars who lined up at 6 a.m., and her peach muffins earned blue ribbons at the local food festival 3 years running. But few knew the Clara who slipped out the bakery's back door at 5:15 each morning, a small paper bag in her hands. Inside were 2 warm muffins, a thermos of coffee, and a note scribbled in her neat handwriting. "You're not alone." She left it for the man who sat on the bench across the street, his threadbare coat pulled tight against the morning chill. He was a veteran, like her father, his eyes carrying that same distant horizon. For 6 years, she fed him, not out of pity, but out of a quiet conviction that no one should feel invisible. And on her wedding day, when he stepped into the church, Clara's heart sang with the knowledge that he had come, not just as a guest, but as a reminder that kindness, however small, could echo through a lifetime. Every morning long before the sleepy town of Ashland stirred, Clara Bennett slipped into the hushed warmth of her bakery kitchen. The world outside was still cloaked in darkness, the streets silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. No robins chirped yet from their perches on the rain gutters, no postmen trudged along their routes, and the hum of traffic was still hours away. But Clara was awake, her heart beating with a quiet purpose that had become as much a part of her as breathing. She tied her flour-dusted apron around her waist, the soft cotton brushing against her skin like an old friend, and flipped on the ovens. Their gentle hum filled the air, a familiar song that greeted her each dawn. By 5 a.m, the first trays of croissants were already rising, their buttery aroma weaving through the kitchen, mingling with the rich, earthy scent of freshly brewed coffee. Clara moved with a grace born of years of repetition, kneading dough, folding it with care, sprinkling sugar with a flick of her wrist, baking each pastry to golden perfection. Her hands worked with a quiet confidence, muscle memory guiding every motion. But for all the customers who would later crowd the bakery, marveling at the flaky crusts and warm, pillowy centers, the true magic of Clara's morning happened long before they arrived. At precisely 5:15, Clara paused her work, her hands still dusted with flour, and turned her attention to a small, deliberate ritual. She reached for a warm pastry, sometimes a blueberry muffin, its top cracked and studded with sugar crystals, other times a slice of quiche, its custard soft and fragrant with herbs. She wrapped it carefully in wax paper, the crinkle of the material a soft whisper in the quiet kitchen. Then, she poured exactly 12 ounces of steaming coffee into a biodegradable cup, the dark liquid swirling with a faint sheen. On Fridays, for reasons she couldn't quite explain even to herself, She stirred in a teaspoon of sugar, watching it dissolve into the brew. It was a small gesture, a flicker of sweetness to mark the end of the week. With the bundle in hand, she slipped out the back door of the bakery, her boots tapping lightly against the pavement as she walked 2 blocks to the bus stop. There, on a weathered wooden bench, she placed the meal with a tenderness that felt almost sacred. On chilly mornings when the air bit at her fingertips, she tucked an extra napkin beneath the pastry. On windy days when the world seemed restless, she weighed down her handwritten note with a smooth gray stone she kept in her pocket for just that purpose. The notes were simple but heartfelt, scrawled in her neat looping handwriting. Wishing you strength to face the day. May this bring a little light to your morning. Still here, still believing in you. She never signed her name. There was no need. This wasn't about her. The recipient of her quiet kindness was always the same man. No one in Ashland knew his name, and Clara never asked. He was older, likely in his 70s, his thinning silver hair catching the faint glow of streetlights in the pre-dawn haze. His gray coat, threadbare and faded, hung loosely on his stooped frame, its fabric pockmarked with the scars of too many winters. He never begged, never spoke, never met anyone's gaze. He simply sat on the bench, still as a statue, his presence as constant as the sunrise. His eyes, when Clara dared to glance at them, were soft but distant, carrying the weight of a life she could only imagine. She never approached him, never tried to bridge the silent space between them. Instead, she let her offering speak for her, a warm pastry, a steaming cup, a note that carried her hopes for him. It was enough. For Clara, it was more than enough. Her routine had become a ritual, a quiet thread woven into the fabric of her days. It wasn't something she planned or thought much about. It simply was. But beneath the surface, it carried a weight that anchored her. Clara knew what it was to be unseen, to carry a quiet struggle no one else noticed. Her father had been that way, proud, silent, wrestling with demons the world never acknowledged until it was too late. She saw a piece of him in the man on the bench, in the way he sat with his shoulders hunched, as if guarding a story too heavy to share. Each morning when she placed the meal beside him, she felt a small piece of her own grief soften, as if the act of giving was also a way of healing. It wasn't pity that drove her, nor charity in the way most people understood it. It was a recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that the world could be cold and careless. But she didn't have to be. Most of the bakery staff didn't notice her ritual. The ones who did often dismissed it. A few rolled their eyes when they caught her wrapping an extra pastry, their sighs heavy with judgment. One newer employee, a young man with a sharp tongue and a quick laugh, once scoffed as he watched her fold the wax paper. "You know, he's probably not even homeless," he said, leaning against the counter with a smirk. "Could just be gaming you for free food." His words hung in the air, sharp and careless, but Clara only smiled faintly and kept working. She didn't mind their skepticism. She wasn't doing it for them or for anyone else. She wasn't even doing it for the man on the bench, not really. It was for herself, for the part of her that needed to believe kindness could still mean something in a world that often forgot how to care. Even Nathan, her fiancé, didn't know about her morning ritual. A firefighter with a heart as steady as her own, Nathan carried his own quiet code of service. He understood the kind of dignity that didn't demand applause, the kind of work that happened in the shadows. Clara loved that about him, the way he could walk into a burning building or comfort a stranger without ever needing to be seen. She could have told him about the man at the bus stop, about the notes and the pastries and the coffee, but she didn't. It wasn't a secret, not exactly. It was just hers, a small piece of her world that didn't need words. Nathan would have understood, but Clara found a strange comfort in keeping this one act to herself. Like a prayer, she whispered only to the dawn. For 6 years, through biting winters and sweltering summers, Clara carried on. Snow dusted her coat as she walked, her breath puffing in clouds. Heat shimmered off the pavement, making her skin prickle. But the man was always there, his presence as steady as her own. He never thanked her, never spoke, but sometimes he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible dip of his head, his eyes softening for a moment before drifting back to the distance. Clara didn't need his gratitude. She needed his presence, the quiet continuity of their unspoken exchange. She didn't know his story, didn't know the roads that had led him to that bench. She didn't need to. All she saw was someone the world had overlooked, someone who carried their pain in silence, just as her father once had. And in that quiet space between them, between the giver and the receiver, the pastry and the presence, Clara felt a connection, fragile but real. It was a reminder that kindness, like the bread she baked, rose best in warmth and patience, and that even the smallest acts could carry the weight of healing for them both. 2. In a sleepy little town where secrets were as scarce as skyscrapers, even the smallest deeds cast long shadows. Clara's quiet act of kindness had rippled through the community, not with a roar, but with a whisper that grew louder with each passing day. It all started with Melissa, a newcomer to the bakery with a knack for noticing things others missed. 3 months into her job, her sharp gaze and even sharper tongue had already made her a presence in the flour-dusted kitchen. One chilly morning, as Clara slipped back through the rear door, her hands empty after her usual delivery, Melissa leaned toward a coworker, her voice low but pointed. "She's at it again, feeding that guy out there. Doesn't even get a thank you for it." Her words carried a mix of curiosity and judgment, as if Clara's generosity was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Melissa's observation didn't stay quiet for long. A few days later, her comment grew bolder, loud enough to catch the ear of a customer lingering by the counter. "We're probably the only bakery in town dishing out free breakfast to the homeless like it's some kind of loyalty perk," she said with a smirk. The customer let out a soft chuckle, amused by the idea, but Clara, standing nearby, didn't join in. Her face remained calm, her hands steady as she smoothed icing over a batch of scones. She didn't snap back or offer an explanation. Instead, she let the words settle into her, heavy and familiar. They stung not because she cared about Melissa's opinion, but because they echoed a truth she'd long wrestled with. In a world quick to judge, kindness was often mistaken for foolishness. Clara's heart ached at the thought, but it only steeled her resolve. She wasn't feeding a stranger out of pity. She was honoring a deeper call, one tied to memories of her father's own struggles, his quiet dignity in the face of hardship. Weeks passed, and the whispers grew into something more formal. Kyle, the bakery's new manager, called Clara into his office for a private chat. He was a man of careful words and calculated gestures, his desk a shrine to profit margins and online reviews. Folding his hands, he leaned forward, his tone polite but practiced. "Clara, your work here is stellar, truly, but we've had some feedback from customers." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. One woman mentioned feeling uneasy seeing a homeless man near the shop every morning. His eyes searched hers as if expecting agreement, but Clara's face gave nothing away. "Your generosity is inspiring," he went on, "but maybe it'd be better, safer, even, if we channeled that energy through a proper shelter. Something organized." The suggestion felt like a nudge toward conformity, a way to tidy up her compassion into something less visible. Clara's chest tightened, but she managed a small smile. "I understand," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside. She left the meeting with her head high, but her heart heavy, wondering if the world would ever see kindness as strength rather than weakness. Instead of stopping, Clara adapted. She started arriving 15 minutes earlier, slipping out to leave her offering before the bakery stirred to life. If the town wanted her generosity to be invisible, she'd make it so, but she wouldn't let it fade. For Clara, the man at the bench wasn't just a figure in a tattered coat. He was a reflection of her father's weary eyes, the pride that flickered even when the world turned its back. She saw the weight of years etched into his silence, the quiet dignity that refused to be snuffed out. Every morning as she left a small breakfast by the bench, she wasn't just giving food, she was offering respect, a reminder that he was seen, that he mattered. On days when life pressed hard, when wedding plans loomed or a fever dragged at her limbs, she still made the trip, her commitment unwavering. The notes she tucked alongside the food were simple, soft lifelines in a world that hurried past without a glance. She didn't need gratitude or recognition. For Clara, the act itself was enough. But someone was watching. For nearly 6 years, the man at the bench had been a constant in Clara's mornings, as steady as the scent of cinnamon or the slow rise of dough. He was always there before she arrived, his presence quiet and unassuming, like a shadow that moved with the dawn. He never lingered long after she left, as if his existence belonged only to that fleeting moment between night and day. Clara noticed everything about him, the way he kept his coat buttoned tight, even in the warmth of spring, as if guarding against a cold that lived deeper than the weather. The way he waited until she was gone before reaching for the food, a small act of pride that tugged at her heart. She didn't know his name, and he didn't know hers, but their silent ritual had woven a thread of connection through the years. Then came the morning that changed everything. Tucked among the usual bustle of flour and sugar, Clara found an envelope waiting for her, a wedding invitation, sent by a stranger with no return address. Her breath caught as she turned it over in her hands, her mind racing. 6 years of quiet, unthanked breakfasts had built towards something she could never have imagined, a moment that would soon ripple through the town, leaving an imprint no one could ignore. As she stood there, the weight of those years settled over her, not as a burden, but as a quiet triumph, a testament to the power of kindness that asked for nothing in return. Every morning, Clara made her way to the quiet corner behind the bakery, her hands steady as she placed a neatly folded napkin on the worn wooden bench. The act felt almost sacred, the napkin pressed precisely in half, its edges aligned with care, as though she were preparing an offering for someone who mattered deeply. She didn't know why this ritual had begun. Not exactly, but it had grown into a part of her, woven into the rhythm of her days. The man who sat there, day after day, was a stranger in name, but not in spirit. His presence stirred something in her, a quiet ache, a longing to ease the weight of a life she could only imagine. Sometimes when the air hung still and the streets of the small town lay hushed, Clara would catch him looking her way as she turned to leave. It wasn't a pleading glance, nor one filled with thanks. It was simpler, softer, a fleeting acknowledgement, as if he were saying, "I see you too." That look lingered in her mind long after she'd walked away, filling her with a warmth she couldn't quite name. She wondered about him endlessly, crafting names for him in the privacy of her thoughts. James, with its sturdy reliability. Walter, carrying the weight of old stories. Samuel, gentle and timeless. For an entire year, she called him Mr. Brooks in her head, picturing a man who'd once had a life full of purpose, now tucked away behind tired eyes and a frayed coat. But the truth was, she didn't need his name to care about him. Caring, she realized, didn't require details. It thrived in the quiet spaces between knowing and not knowing. Clara's mornings were her sanctuary, but one icy December dawn changed everything. She arrived earlier than usual, the sky still cloaked in deep indigo, stars faintly blinking above. Her breath clouded in the frigid air as she set down not just the napkin, but a slice of cranberry orange loaf, its tangy sweetness still warm from the oven. Beside it, she placed a steaming cup of dark roast coffee, its rich aroma curling into the cold. Tucked beneath was a small note, her handwriting careful and deliberate, "Wishing you warmth." She lingered for a moment, her heart heavy with the weight of the gesture, then turned to walk away. But this time something stopped her, a voice, low and rough, like gravel underfoot. "You ever get tired of doing this?" The words hit her like a gust of wind, not because they startled her, but because she'd never imagined hearing his voice. It was worn, cracked from years of silence, yet it carried a quiet strength. Clara froze, her boots rooted to the frosty ground. Slowly she turned back, her heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and reverence. His eyes met hers, steady but guarded, waiting for her answer. She swallowed, her voice soft but sure. "No," she said. Then after a pause she added, "Do you ever get tired of accepting it?" His lips twitched, the smallest hint of a smile breaking through the weathered lines of his face. It was a smile that spoke of surprise, of someone unaccustomed to being seen so clearly. "Really?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He nodded once, as if to himself, and added, "No one's asked me that in a long time." The words hung between them, fragile and heavy, before the silence settled back in. That was the only conversation they ever shared, but it marked a turning point. From that day on, Clara noticed subtle shifts in him. He began to sit a little taller on the bench, his shoulders no longer hunched against the world. His coat, though still threadbare, looked cleaner, as if he'd taken a moment to brush away the dust of neglect. One morning she saw a new pair of gloves on his hands, simple, black, but clearly chosen with care. These changes weren't loud or dramatic, but to Clara they were profound. They were the quiet signs of a man remembering how to claim his place in the world, how to exist beyond mere survival. Each glimpse of this filled her with a quiet joy, tinged with the bittersweet knowledge that she might never know the full story behind his transformation. Then came a rainy Tuesday in February, the kind of day that soaked through shoes and chilled to the bone. Clara left a scarf beside his breakfast that morning, a woolen one her mother had knitted years ago, its deep burgundy threads fraying at the ends, but still thick and warm. It was her favorite, a piece of her past she'd clung to through countless winters. Giving it away felt like letting go of something precious, but it also felt right, like the scarf had always been meant for him. When she returned the next morning, the scarf was gone. In its place, on the bench, lay the napkin she'd left the day before, now bearing a message in shaky pencil. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." Clara's breath caught as she read it. Her fingers trembled as she folded the note and slipped it into her wallet, where it would stay, a talisman of sorts. That simple sentence became her compass, a reminder that kindness didn't need to be grand to carry weight. It was enough to see someone, truly see them, and act on that recognition. She carried the note with her always, its words grounding her through the chaos of life, a quiet promise to keep showing up, keep caring, even when the world felt too heavy. Still, Clara never asked his name. She never pushed for more than he was willing to give. She understood, instinctively, that silence could be a shield, a way to protect wounds too deep for words. People carried their reasons for quiet like scars, hidden beneath layers of time and pain, and she respected that boundary. To press would be to unravel something sacred, and she couldn't bring herself to do it. The mystery deepened 2 weeks before her wedding. Clara found an envelope tucked under the bakery's back door, no postage or return address, just her name, Clara Bennett, written in tight, deliberate script. Her heart stuttered as she opened it, revealing a single card inside. The message was brief but striking. "Tomorrow I will come not for cake but to honor a debt." She read it again, her mind racing. The words weren't threatening, nor were they overly warm. They felt formal, almost ceremonial, like something from another time. A military cadence, perhaps, or the vow of someone bound by duty. Clara kept the note to herself, not even sharing it with Nathan, her fiancé. But deep in her bones, she knew who had written it. She just didn't understand what he meant by debt. On the day of her wedding, as she stood in the bride's room adjusting her veil, her nerves a quiet hum beneath her excitement, Clara glanced out the window. There he was, the man from the bench, standing near the church entrance. He looked out of place, his posture stiff in a suit that had been carefully pressed by hand, the fabric worn but dignified. His shoes, scuffed and aged, gleamed with a dull polish, a testament to effort. His silver hair was combed neatly, and his eyes scanned the crowd with a quiet intensity. He was no longer the shadow figure from the bench. He was a man whole, or at least trying to be. Clara's heart swelled at the sight, a mix of awe and tenderness. Whispers rippled through the guest. Who is he? Why's he here? But Clara didn't falter. She didn't need to know his past to understand one truth. This man had once been someone. Someone who laughed, who dreamed, who mattered. And in that moment, as she stepped toward her new life, she carried the weight of that truth with her. Knowing her small acts of kindness, had helped him remember it too. Clara Bennett's heart pounded with a rhythm that rivaled the joyous hum of the church around her. The weight of her wedding gown, with its intricate lace and flowing train, felt like an extension of her own trembling spirit, trailing behind her like a whisper of dreams she'd long held close. Her auburn hair, adorned with delicate sprigs of lavender, caught the soft light filtering through the stained glass windows, casting fleeting violets and golds across her face. In her hands, she clutched a bouquet of lilac and cream roses, their petals soft as a promise. Yet her thoughts were far from the altar where her groom waited. Her eyes, wish-on and searching, darted toward the entrance of the church, where a figure stood framed against the morning's tender glow. He was there, the man from the bench. Clara didn't know his name, not yet, but his presence stirred something deep within her, a memory woven from countless quiet mornings. She saw more than just a man in a faded gray suit, meticulously pressed despite its age. The cuffs folded with a precision that spoke of pride in small details. His shoes, worn but polished to a mirror-like sheen, told a story of effort, of someone who refused to let the world's indifference dim their dignity. His frame, slightly stooped, carried the weight of years and unspoken sorrows. Yet he stood tall, as if defying the gravity of his past. In his rough-veined hands he held a simple envelope, its edges worn but held with care, as though it contained something sacred. Clara's chest tightened as she recalled the first time she'd seen him, 6 years ago on a frostbitten morning at the bus stop near her bakery. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion, had met hers with a quiet intensity that seemed to pierce through the fog of her routine. She'd handed him a blueberry muffin, still warm from the oven, not out of pity but from an instinct she couldn't name, a need to offer something, anything, to ease the weariness etched into his face. That small act had sparked a silent ritual between them, a dance of kindness that unfolded over years. He'd never asked for anything, but he always showed up, a constant in her ever-changing world. And now, on the day she was to step into her future, he was here, standing at the threshold of her new life. The church buzzed in with whispers, the congregation's curiosity rippling like a current through the pews. Who invited him? Is that the guy from the bus stop? No way she actually invited him, right? The words stung, but Clara let them slide off her like rain on glass. She didn't care about their judgments or the raised eyebrows of her bridesmaids who stood frozen in their pastel dresses, or the wedding planner's frantic gesture to keep the schedule on track. Her heart was a compass, and it pointed to him. Without a word, she gathered the heavy folds of her gown, the fabric whispering against the stone floor, and moved toward him. The gasps of the crowd faded into a distant hum as she closed the distance, her steps steady despite the tremor in her hands. When she reached him, Clara didn't hesitate. She wrapped her arms around him, her embrace fierce and unwavering, as if she could hold together the pieces of a man the world had tried to break. Tears spilled down her cheeks, smudging the mascara she'd painstakingly applied that morning, loosening the curls she'd spent hours perfecting. But none of that mattered. In that moment, he wasn't a stranger. He was every forgotten soul she'd ever ached for, every invisible person society had turned its back on. He was her father, long gone, but never forgotten, his memory stitched into the fabric of her being. He was a survivor, standing tall against a tide of unspeakable pain. "I still remember your eyes," she whispered, her voice catching on the edge of a sob. "That first morning in winter. You looked so tired, like you'd carried the weight of the world." Her words were soft, meant only for him, a tether to a moment they'd shared years ago. He didn't respond immediately, and for a heartbeat, Clara feared he might not speak at all. But when he did, his voice was steady, clear, and laced with a warmth that surprised her. "I remember the muffin," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Blueberry, warm. I hadn't tasted kindness in months." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of gratitude, of a man who'd found a flicker of light in a long, dark season. Clara's smile broke through her tears, radiant and unreserved. The church had fallen silent, the weight of their exchange pulling every eye to them. The air felt charged, as if the moment itself held its breath. And then, the heavy oak doors of the church swung open, a sharp gust of wind sweeping through the aisle, catching the delicate edge of Clara's veiledish and sending it fluttering like a caught bird. The congregation turned as one, their murmurs swallowed by the sudden rhythmic thud of boots against the stone floor. 12 Marines, resplendent in their dress blues, marched in with a precision that seemed to command the very air. Their uniforms were immaculate, white gloves gleaming, metals polished to a mirror shine, creases sharp enough to cut through doubt. The lead Marine, a tall man with a chest adorned with ribbons and a nameplate reading Duncan, stepped forward with an authority that parted the crowd like water. The formation moved toward Clara and the man, their steps echoing like thunder in the hallowed space. With a single fluid motion, they raised their arms in a crisp, unified salute, not to a general, not to a commanding officer, but to Clara Bennett, the unassuming baker who had spent years quietly changing lives with her kindness. Captain Duncan broke formation, his presence commanding yet reverent. His voice, when he spoke, was firm but carried a warmth that mirrored the man beside Clara. On behalf of Alpha Company, he began, his words resonating through the silent church, we honor Clara Bennett for her unwavering compassion and the light she has brought to those who needed it most. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her eyes darting to the man beside her. She didn't yet know his name was Victor Hale, nor that he was a retired Marine sergeant who had saved lives in the chaos of Fallujah. She didn't know of the car accident that had stolen his wife and daughter, leaving him too broken to accept the title of hero. All she knew was that he had shown up, time and again, and now so had she. And in that moment, as the Marines stood in tribute and the congregation held its breath, Clara felt the weight of every small act of kindness she'd ever offered, magnified into something far greater than she'd ever imagined. In the quiet heart of a small Oregon town, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines gathered in a modest church, their uniforms crisp against the soft glow of stained glass. They stood not for ceremony alone, but to pay tribute to a woman whose quiet acts of kindness had woven a lifeline for one of their own through the darkest days of his existence. Captain Duncan, his voice steady yet brimming with reverence, turned to the congregation, his eyes settling on Victor, a man whose weathered face held a storm of memories. Beside him stood Clara, her expression a mix of confusion and quiet grace, unaware of the weight her presence carried in this moment. This is Sergeant Victor Hale, Duncan announced, his gesture toward Victor heavy with gratitude. In 2004, in the chaos of Fallujah, he pulled 9 Marines from the jaws of an ambush, including me. Shrapnel tore through his leg, but he went back into the fray again and again, carrying men to safety. Duncan's voice wavered, not from weakness, but from the raw memory of that day, dust choking the air, the crack of gunfire, and Victor's unrelenting resolve. He earned a Silver Star for his courage, though he never once claimed it. That's the kind of man he is. Victor stood motionless, his jaw tight, as if the weight of those words pressed against wounds he'd long buried. Clara's hand rested lightly on his arm, her touch grounding him as his heart churned with the ghosts of war. A hush blanketed the church, the kind that settles when truth cuts through the ordinary. Duncan held up a shadow box, its contents gleaming under the soft light, a Silver Star medal pinned beside an old photograph. The image captured a younger Victor, his face streaked with blood and grime, cradling a wounded Marine across a street littered with rubble. Behind him, a barely conscious Duncan clung to life, his eyes half open, trusting in the strength of the man who carried him. If not for Victor, Duncan said, his voice thick with emotion, I wouldn't be standing here today. And if not for Clara Bennett, Sergeant Hale might not have survived to show us what true valor looks like, not just in war, but in the quiet battles fought in the heart. Clara's breath hitched, her eyes darting to Victor. Tears glistened in his gaze, reflecting a vulnerability he'd hidden for years. I never knew, she whispered, her voice trembling with the realization that her simple acts had anchored a man she barely understood. Victor's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. That was the point, he said softly, his words carrying the weight of a man who'd spent years running from his own story. I didn't want thanks, I just needed to feel human again. You, Clara, you gave me that. His voice broke, and in that moment, the church seemed to shrink around them, as if the world had paused to witness the unspoken bond between 2 souls who'd saved each other without knowing it. A bridesmaid stepped forward, her bouquet trembling in her hands as she wiped tears from her cheeks. I work with Clara, she said, her voice carrying a mix of awe and confession. She never told us what she was doing. Every morning she'd come in early, using her own money to buy flour, eggs, whatever she needed. She'd bake, cook, and leave breakfast for anyone who needed it, no questions asked. The woman's voice faltered, her heart heavy with the memory of Clara's quiet diligence, a kindness they'd overlooked. Another coworker rose, her face flushed with shame. We teased her, she admitted, her words shaky. We thought she was just being overly nice, maybe even naive. We didn't understand, but now I see it. I see her. Duncan turned to Clara, his eyes shining with respect. In the Corps, we live by a code. Never leave a Marine behind. Clara Bennett, you've lived that code without ever wearing the uniform. You've carried one of ours through the shadows, not with fanfare, but with the kind of compassion that changes lives. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the guests. Then one by one they rose to their feet, not out of obligation, but because they felt the presence of something rare and extraordinary. Clara stood among them, her heart pounding, overwhelmed by the recognition she'd never sought. Nathan, Clara's groom, stepped forward, his face alight with pride and love. He extended his hand to Victor, his voice steady but warm. "Sir, it would be our honor if you would walk Clara down the aisle." Victor hesitated, his throat tight with emotion. He glanced at Clara, her eyes soft with encouragement, and nodded. Taking her hand, he felt the warmth of her fingers, a reminder of the humanity she'd restored in him. Together they walked forward, not just toward a wedding, but toward a new chapter, one built on years of unseen kindness, now illuminated for all to see. The wedding became a story that rippled beyond the church's walls, capturing the hearts of their small Oregon town and beyond. A photograph of 12 Marines, their salutes crisp and reverent, honoring a tearful bride in a delicate lace gown, spread across social media. Local papers picked it up, their headlines simple but poignant, and soon the image reached national military circles. Yet Clara, ever humble, barely noticed the attention. Her heart was elsewhere, focused on living a life that didn't chase applause, but sought to make a difference. She and Nathan postponed their honeymoon, not out of necessity, but because Clara's mind was alight with a new purpose. With their wedding gift money, they founded the Hearth Bench, a breakfast program housed in the church's fellowship hall. Every morning from 6 to 8 a.m., volunteers served steaming coffee, fresh pastries, and hearty meals to homeless veterans and anyone else who needed a moment of warmth and dignity. There were no forms to fill out, no IDs to show, just a long wooden bench crafted by a local artisan with words carved into its backrest. "Feeding one person can nourish a life the world forgot." For Clara, it wasn't about recognition. It was about ensuring no one felt invisible, just as she'd done for Victor all those years ago. In the dim, pre-dawn hours, Clara Bennett moved through her kitchen with the quiet grace of someone who had long ago made peace with solitude. Her hands, dusted with flour, worked the dough with a rhythm born of years of practice, each knead a silent prayer for the day ahead. The small town was still asleep, its streets cloaked in the hush of early morning. But Clara's heart was awake, stirring with a purpose she hadn't fully understood when she first began. She thought of the bench outside the fellowship hall, the one she used to leave her baked goods on, wrapped in care and accompanied by a simple note. That bench had been her quiet rebellion against the world's indifference, a small act of defiance against the anonymity that swallowed so many. At first, it was just 3 souls who found her offerings, 2 older men, their faces etched with the weight of years and unspoken stories, and a younger woman whose eyes never lifted from the ground, as if the world had taught her to hide. Clara didn't know their names then, but she felt their presence, their quiet gratitude woven into the air each time they took her gifts. Word of her kindness spread like wildfire through the town, carried on whispers and grateful nods. By the 3rd week, the fellowship hall was no longer a quiet sanctuary for a handful of lost souls. It was alive, brimming with people, some weary, some hopeful, all drawn by the warmth of Clara's hearth and the promise of a meal that came with no judgment. The room hummed with soft conversations, the clink of spoons against bowls, and the occasional burst of laughter that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Clara stood behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour, her heart swelling with a quiet pride she'd never voice. She thought of Victor, the man whose absence now felt like a bittersweet ache. He'd been the first to leave a note on that bench, a scrawled message that had pierced her heart. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." She'd assumed he'd vanished back into the shadows of his solitary life, a life she imagined was heavy with the weight of battles fought and losses endured. The thought filled her with a tender sorrow, a quiet wish that she could have done more. But Clara was wrong about Victor. One crisp morning, as the scent of fresh muffins filled the kitchen, a letter arrived. It bore no return address, only a postmark from Arizona. Inside was a postcard, its front adorned with the fiery hues of red rock canyons, and a single line in handwriting that made Clara's breath catch. "Every breakfast is a salute. Thank you. VH." Her fingers trembled as she read it, her mind racing with questions she'd never asked. Where was he? What had drawn him to Arizona? Was he okay? She tacked the postcard to the bulletin board in the kitchen, its edges curling slightly under the weight of her unspoken hopes. A month later, another arrived from Montana, then one from Virginia, each carrying the same message, as if Victor was weaving a thread across the country, tying himself to the hearth he'd left behind. The volunteers, a ragtag group of kind-hearted locals, began calling the board the Wall of Gratitude, their voices tinged with awe for the mysterious sender. Clara never told them it was Victor. She held his story close, a quiet treasure she wasn't ready to share. Captain Duncan became a familiar face in the fellowship hall, his presence as steady as the tides. Once a month, he arrived with a group of Marines from the wedding where Clara's baking had first caught their attention. They came not in their crisp uniforms, but in civilian clothes, blending seamlessly with the crowd. Their hands, accustomed to the weight of rifles, now ladled soup and scrubbed dishes with a humility that moved Clara deeply. She watched them from the corner of her eye, her heart swelling with respect for their quiet service. One morning, Duncan brought a young recruit, barely out of his teens, his eyes wide with the eagerness of youth. "This," Duncan said, his voice low but firm, "is what it means to carry the code off the battlefield." The words landed in Clara's chest like a stone, stirring memories of Victor and the battles he'd fought, both on distant fields and within himself. Later, Duncan shared that Victor was finally getting help, counseling, medical care, a clean bed to sleep in. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was leading, guiding other veterans through the labyrinth of a system that had once failed him. Clara's eyes stung with tears she didn't let fall, her heart a tangle of pride and relief. Each morning, Clara arrived at 4:30 a.m., her routine unchanged but her purpose transformed. She totted her apron with the same quiet focus, but now when she stepped out of the kitchen at 5:15, she didn't leave food on the bench. Instead, she walked into a room filled with stories, forgotten souls finding their way back to being seen, being heard. The hearth bench, once just a slab of wood, had become something sacred, a testament to the power of unseen kindness. It stood as a reminder that transformation doesn't always come with fanfare or applause. Sometimes it begins with a muffin, a napkin note, and a heart that refuses to give up. Clara's notes still carried the same message, still here, still baking. But now they were more than words. They were a promise, a vow to keep showing up for those the world had overlooked. The hearth bench was no longer just a place to eat. It was a sanctuary, a haven where the invisible were seen, where broken spirits were pieced back together with warm food and simple acknowledgement. Behind the serving counter, the wall of gratitude grew, each postcard a beacon of hope. At its center hung Victor's first note, its edges worn from time, but its words as sharp as ever. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." Below it, Clara had added her own message, written in her careful script. "Everyone who sits at this table has a story worth knowing." She believed it with every fiber of her being. Heroism, she learned, wasn't always loud or adorned with medals. It was in the quiet consistency of showing up, of offering a hand without expecting thanks. Victor's story and the stories of those who now filled the fellowship hall reminded her that beneath worn coats and tired eyes were hearts still beating, still hoping, still worthy of love. Clara never sought recognition for her work. She never imagined that her early mornings, spent kneading dough and crafting notes, would ripple outward to touch so many lives. But in the quiet of her kitchen, in the warmth of the hearth bench, she'd found her calling. The smallest acts of kindness, she realized, could become the loudest voices in a world too often silent. The hearth bench stood as a symbol of respect, a gathering place where the forgotten were remembered, where the broken were made whole again through the simple, profound act of being seen. Every face tells a story, etched with lines of bravery, sacrifice, and an unyielding hope that yearns for someone to listen. Clara's tale, woven with threads of relentless kindness, stands as a testament to the truth that every soul deserves to be acknowledged, not just for their deeds, but for the essence of who they are. Her story, intertwined with Victor's, unfolds as a quiet yet powerful reminder of what it means to truly see another person in a world that often rushes past the unnoticed. Clara, a woman with a heart as vast as the open sky, carried a warmth that could soften even the hardest of days. Her eyes, bright with empathy, seemed to hold an unspoken promise. No one in her presence would ever feel like a shadow. She lived in a small American town where the rhythm of life pulsed with both hustle and heart. It was here, amid the daily grind, that she crossed paths with Victor, a man whose existence had faded into the background of society's hurried pace. Victor was weathered not just by time but by life's unrelenting storms. His clothes hung loosely on a frame that spoke of hunger, and his eyes carried a quiet resignation, as if he'd long accepted being invisible to the world. Yet Clara saw him, not just a glance, but a deep, intentional seeing. She noticed the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of unspoken struggles, the way his gaze darted nervously when others passed by. Her heart ached at the thought of someone feeling so unseen. So she began leaving small meals for him, simple offerings of soup, bread, or a sandwich wrapped in care. At first, Victor hesitated, his pride warring with his hunger. He wondered why this stranger cared, what she could possibly gain from feeding someone like him. But Clara's consistency wore down his defenses. Day after day, her quiet acts of kindness became a lifeline, a reminder that he was still part of the world. Clara's thoughts often lingered on Victor, even when she was alone. She wondered about the life he'd lived before the streets claimed him. Perhaps he'd had a family, a home filled with laughter, dreams that once burned brightly. She didn't need to know the details to feel the weight of his humanity. To her, he wasn't just a man in need. He was a story, a soul deserving of dignity. When others asked why she bothered, why she poured her time and resources into someone she barely knew, Clara's answer was always the same. With a gentle smile that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages, she'd say, "Because no one should ever feel like they don't exist." Her words weren't rehearsed or performative. They flowed from a place of deep conviction, a belief that every person deserved to be seen, heard, and valued. Victor, on his part, wrestled with a storm of emotions. Gratitude mingled with shame, hope clashed with fear. Each meal Clara left was more than food. It was a message that he mattered. He'd sit in the quiet of an alley, unwrapping her latest offering, and feel a flicker of warmth in his chest, a spark of something he thought he'd lost forever. He began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to a life where he wasn't invisible. Clara's kindness didn't just feed his body, it nourished a seed of hope that had long been buried under layers of despair. Their story resonates deeply in today's America, where the tension between independence and compassion defines so much of our lives. In a world that celebrates speed and success, it's easy to overlook those who move more slowly, whose struggles are hidden behind stoic faces or tattered clothes. Victor was one of those souls, a man society had deemed invisible until Clara chose to see him. Her actions weren't loud or flashy. They required no audience or applause. They were born from a heart that refused to let anyone slip through the cracks, a heart that understood the profound power of small, consistent gestures. Clara's example challenges us to pause and reflect. How often do we rush past the people around us, too caught up in our own lives to notice their quiet struggles? How often do we let snap judgments or fleeting assumptions dim our capacity for kindness? Her story urges us to look closer, to see the humanity in every face, whether it's a neighbor wrestling with loneliness, a stranger carrying unseen burdens, or a coworker hiding their pain behind a smile. It asks us to consider how we might embody Clara's quiet strength in our own lives, through a kind word, a moment of patience, or a simple acknowledgement of someone's worth. The ripples of Clara's actions stretch far beyond what she could have imagined. Each meal she gave Victor was a pebble dropped into the still waters of his life, sending waves of hope and dignity outward. Her kindness didn't just change him, it changed the way he saw himself, the way he dared to hope for a future. And for those who heard their story, it planted a seed of inspiration, a reminder that compassion doesn't need a grand stage to make a difference. A single act done with intention can light up the darkest corners of someone's world. This tale of Clara and Victor is a call to action, especially for those who have weathered their own storms and know the value of a kind hand extended in a moment of need. It invites us to be the light for others, to offer warmth to those who may never ask for it, but desperately need it. Whether it's helping a neighbor with a small task, listening with full presence to a friend's troubles, or simply offering a smile to a stranger, these gestures carry a weight far greater than we might realize. They remind us that every person, no matter their circumstances, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. In a world that often feels divided and rushed, Clara's story is a beacon, guiding us toward a simpler, more human way of living. It's a reminder that kindness doesn't require wealth, status, or grand gestures, just a willing heart and the courage to act. So let us take up her challenge, to see the unseen, to honor the quiet heroes among us, and to weave compassion into the fabric of our daily lives. In doing so, we not only change the lives of others, but rediscover the beauty of our own humanity.